In January 1997, Final Fantasy VII was released in Japan for the Sony PlayStation. Later that same year, a slightly altered version was released to North America and Europe. After the massive success of this release, Squaresoft realized that they could extend their player base even further in the Western world. So they appointed a very small staff of 15 to 20 people to create a PC port of the game to be released in North America and Europe only. They also reached out to Eidos Interactive, who had previously released Tomb Raider for the PC, and they agreed to help market and publish the port. The finished product would be a 4-disc PC port of the game in a giant blue Eidos Interactive box. The original Final Fantasy VII was quite the clustered mess and built specifically for the PlayStation 1 using 5 separate engines. But surprisingly, this PC port was extremely well made. The team at Squaresoft rewrote an estimated 80% of the game's code in order for it to work correctly on the PC. They also made some graphical changes, a few very minor gameplay changes, and optimized a lot of the back-end memory manipulation, causing the game to load much faster. Not to mention, the game already loaded faster due to being on a PC. It seems that most forget about this port though, and when talking about the original game, people are usually referring to the PlayStation version. Even though these two versions of the game are extremely similar, there is one very important difference. Hiding inside that big blue Eidos Interactive box is a secret. A secret that would sit inside the game's code for over 16 years. A secret that would become the ultimate Final Fantasy VII glitch and open up a whole new world to explore the game's inner workings. This is the story of the Wrong Warp. The year is 2013, and Square Enix has just released the Steam version of Final Fantasy VII. At first glance, a lot of people think that this is a port of the PlayStation 1 version, but it turns out the game actually uses the source code from the 1998 Eidos Interactive release. There are a few small changes thrown in, some very small bugs that are fixed, some Easter eggs thrown in, and a much needed graphical overhaul. But in general, the game is still Final Fantasy VII, and unless you are playing the original PlayStation 1 version for nostalgia reasons, is definitely the most definitive way to experience the game. All of the music, all of the gameplay, and even all of the crazy glitches are all here, but in a much more accessible package. The old mod community that used to make mods of the original 1998 PC port returned to update their mods for the Steam version. This new version of the game also lights a bit of a fire underneath the speedrunning community. The speedrun of the PlayStation 1 version had been at a bit of a standstill, and although speedrunners had already looked into the old 1998 PC port, they decided to use this opportunity to give the game another look over to see if they could find anything else that could maybe be used to speed up or just make the speedrun more enjoyable. At first, nothing is really found. The code in the Steam version is identical to the code in the original PC port, other than those graphical changes and small bug fixes we talked about earlier. But then in May of 2013, a speedrunner named Neoheart would upload a video to YouTube called Final Fantasy VII Yuffie Warping. In the video, he outlines a method of warping to boss battles and random encounters on both the original PC version and the new Steam version, by game overing on an enemy, loading a different save, and attempting to recruit Yuffie. After beating the Mystery Ninja, instead of placing the party in the field where Yuffie is recruited, the game would warp the party to the last battle they game overed to. If it was a boss battle, the party would actually be warped into the battle, and if it was a random battle, the party would be warped to the spot where the random encounter started.
Now here's where it gets interesting. We are now going to warp to Demon's Gate. And it is playing the music of after you beat Demon's Gate. Now you may be wondering, how does this work? Can't really explain it too well.
This was a really wild discovery, and at the time, no one really understood how it worked. To be honest, it was wild that something like this could even happen, and that it had taken this long to realize that it was always sitting there in the original 1998 port. Now, in terms of speedrunning, this glitch wasn't super helpful, as you could only teleport to places where you had already been. You need to game over on a boss battle and then load another save to teleport to where you game overed. You couldn't use this glitch to warp anywhere new, only to somewhere where you had already game overed. And when doing a speedrun, you need to start on a fresh file. So you couldn't just have a file sitting at the end of the game, start a new game, and then warp to that file. But one man in the community had a crazy idea. That man was Zero Kainos, a legend in the Final Fantasy VII community who has found many things in the game over the years. Kainos decided that he would create his own speedrun category, where the player was allowed to have pre-made saves already in the game when starting the speedrun. Now, of course, you still needed to start the game on a fresh file, and that fresh file needed to be the one that defeated Sephiroth in the end. But in this made-up category, Kainos could use these pre-made saves to Yuffie warp around the game and make the run a lot more interesting. Many years later, this category would be given the name New Game Plus, and go on to have its own section on the speedrun leaderboards. But for now, this was just a fun project that Kainos wanted to try out, and he did the speedrun in segments in order to show a theoretical crazy run that used Yuffie warping to beat the game as fast as possible. This theoretical run had a crazy route, and basically had Kainos playing the game normally until Yuffie is recruitable, Yuffie warping to the final dungeon to trick the game into thinking that Kainos was on Disc 3 already, leaving the dungeon and getting the items and equipment necessary to defeat the final boss, then Yuffie warping back into the final dungeon and finishing out the game. At this point, the world record speedrun for Final Fantasy VII was still over 8 hours. But this theoretical speedrun took only 2 hours and 24 minutes to complete the game. Neoheart would even do a single segment version of this route a year later and get a time of under 3 hours. Later in 2013, Kainos would delve into the game's code and learn exactly how Yuffie warping worked. He would use this knowledge to find another type of warp that he would name Battle Mode Warping. And in order to continue our story, I need to explain to you exactly how Battle Mode Warping works. So strap in, because things are about to get technical. As I mentioned before, Final Fantasy VII runs on 5 different engines. These 5 engines are commonly referred to as modules, and they are the Field Module, the World Map Module, the Battle Module, the Menu Module, and the Minigame Module. Each of these modules work separately from each other, and because of the limitations of the PlayStation 1, only one of these modules can be working at once. Because of this, there is an allocated global memory, where modules can drop information for other modules to use later. For example, when leaving Midgar, the game would store the last field ID variable in the global memory to Midgar Sector 5 Gate. The field module would then deload, the world map module would load, and it would grab that field ID from the global memory to determine where Cloud should go on the world map, which would be right outside of Midgar. Now, as I stated before, the PC version implemented a couple optimizations to make the game load a bit faster. However, they made one very big mistake when implementing these optimizations. Because of the PlayStation 1's memory limitations, when a player game overs, the PlayStation 1 automatically wipes all of the global memory before restarting the game. However, the PC doesn't need to do this, and because the programmers of the port didn't think to put in a special case for this, that memory simply lingers when the game restarts. When loading up a file or starting a completely new game, the game correctly overwrites most of this lingering memory. But in some very special cases, some of this memory may still be there if it wasn't overwritten. And this leads us to the battle mode warp. Normally, when the player gets into a battle, the game deloads the field module and loads the battle module. Then after the battle is completed, it deloads the battle module, loads the menu module to show the victory screen, then deloads the menu module and finally reloads the field module. If the battle happens on the world map, then the same thing happens but with the world map module instead of the field module. However, there is one special case where the modules load a bit differently, and that is when the No Rewards battle mode flag is turned on. Battle mode flags are used throughout the game to slightly alter specific battles. For example, there's a Can't Escape flag, which stops you from escaping from bosses in key battles. And there's also some flags that affect the victory music, victory animations, whether or not you can game over, and so on. In addition to all these, there is one very special battle mode flag called No Rewards. You may have noticed this battle mode flag during the Nibelheim flashback, as when you finish battles with Sephiroth and Young Cloud, the game doesn't show you the victory screen or award any XP or gil. This flag is special because it completely changes the way that the modules load. Instead of going from the field module to the battle module to the menu module and then back to the field module, the game skips over the menu module entirely and just goes from the battle module directly to the field module. Now, because the programmers of Final Fantasy VII cut every single corner they possibly could, they never created a version of this flag for the world map, because the Nibelheim flashback never goes to the world map. So through all of this, Kainos found out that if you were to game over during the Nibelheim flashback, the game would keep both the battle mode flag active and the field ID of the field you game overed on, thanks to the fact that the PC version doesn't wipe memory when you game over. If you then load a save on the world map and defeat a random encounter, the game will incorrectly place you at the last field ID that you game overed on instead of back on the world map. The only problem with actually pulling off this warp is that game overing in the Nibelheim flashback seemed impossible. Sephiroth isn't just extremely powerful during the Nibelheim flashback, he actually is invincible. This version of Sephiroth takes 0 damage from everything in the game, and even has his own script to reduce all damage to 0. Luckily, Kainos came up with an extremely unique and convoluted way of pulling this off. First, he parked the Highwind next to Midgar. Next, he loaded a save in the Shinra HQ and game overed to Motorball. He then loaded his first save and attempted to recruit Yuffie. This initiated a Yuffie warp that sent him back to the Motorball boss fight and tricked the game into thinking that he was on Disc 1. When he defeated Motorball and left Midgar, his Highwind had disappeared, but it was still there. This happens because the game doesn't actually render the Highwind model until Disc 2, but he could still ride around on his invisible Highwind. He drove the Highwind over to Mount Nibel and entered through the back entrance. Because the game thinks that Kainos just left Midgar on Disc 1, the next event is supposed to be the Nibelheim flashback. So now, Kainos is in Mount Nibel during the Nibelheim flashback, but he has his normal party. Because of this, the game activates the No Rewards battle mode flag, but Kainos can game over because Sephiroth isn't in the party. So he game overs, loads a game on the world map, defeats an enemy, and now he has successfully battle mode warped into Mount Nibel. Funnily enough, because we're all the way on this side of the mountain and not where the party usually is, we could just walk out onto the world map instead. Unfortunately, this crashes the game, and I'll explain why a bit later. So game overing allows us to keep that field ID, and then we can simply load a save that's already on the world map. Now after all of that work, you're probably expecting this battle mode warp to do something amazing. But unfortunately, this warp was just as useless as the Yuffie warp. Again, you were only warping somewhere where you had already been. It is truly incredible to think that all of this work was put into this battle mode warp, not knowing that anything would ever come of it. A lot of times, we shoot towards a goal because we know the outcome. We know that if we get really good at a speedrun, we'll get a world record. We know that if we work really hard at a multiplayer game, we can reach some certain rank. But to me, it's just amazing that a lot of glitch hunters don't really have an end game. They just continuously search for what they can find in hopes that one day it might help someone, either with a speed run or a challenge run or just playing the game casually, or just some kind of really cool glitch that they can show off to their friends. At this moment, Yuffie warping and battle mode warping were just cool tricks, and they could be used in the New Game Plus speedrun, but for the most part, they were just there to show how broken this game was. Both Neilhart and Zero Kainos both knew that this could maybe lead to something in the future, but I would like to think that they were content knowing that what they found was still pretty cool. It didn't have to be about revolutionizing the game. It was just simply them exploring the game that they loved. If the story had ended here, their time would not have been wasted, and we would all still look back on their work and be amazed at what they found. But luckily for them, and luckily for us, the story does not end here. Shortly after the battle mode warp was found, Neilhart would strike gold. He would find the ultimate Final Fantasy VII glitch and completely change everything we knew about the PC version. He had found the wrong warp. Wrong warp is a pretty popular term used in speedruns nowadays, and it refers to using a warp in a game but ending up somewhere where the game did not intend. One of the most popular wrong warps is the Super Mario Bros. 3 wrong warp, which sends you directly to the endgame credits. But there are many different wrong warps in many different games, and they usually involve either taking advantage of the way the warping code works inside the game, or rewriting the game's code from within the game and executing it, which is called arbitrary code execution. Now, the two warps that we discussed in this video so far, Yuffie warping and battle mode warping, are technically wrong warps as they are sending you somewhere where the game is not intending. But the Final Fantasy VII community never called them wrong warps because they're just taking you to places where you've already been. And the true essence of the term wrong warp is sending you somewhere completely different. In a speedrun sense, hopefully somewhere near the end of the game or even the credits. For the Final Fantasy VII wrong warp, Neilhart found a way to take the battle mode warp and change it to take you somewhere completely different. Somewhere incredible, both for speedrunners and for the entire Final Fantasy VII community at large. But before I tell you where, let's recap. In order to do a battle mode warp, you need to first game over in the Nibelheim flashback. You can then load a separate save on the world map, which allows you to take the no rewards battle mode flag onto the world map where it's not supposed to be. This tricks the game into sending you to the last field map you were on instead of the world map after defeating an encounter. Neilhart realized that this isn't all that the glitch does. There was another way to change the field that this glitch sends you to. Like many older games, Final Fantasy VII uses the same memory addresses for multiple things in the game. For a simple example, young Cloud and Sephiroth actually take up the same memory addresses as Cait Sith and Vincent. Seeing as though Cait Sith and Vincent are never in the same party as young Cloud and Sephiroth, they were able to do this and save on memory. When you enter a battle on the world map, the battle ID, the number that determines what battle you get, takes the same memory slot as the field ID, the number that tells the game what field the party is on in the field module. It can use this same space because you never see the field module. You go straight from the battle module to the menu module and then to the world map module. This is why the game crashes if you walk out of Mount Nibel to the world map without game overing first. If you game over, the field ID for this field gets stored in memory, and because the game doesn't wipe the memory when you get a game over, it stays there when you load the save on the world map. If you were to load a save on a field, it would just load that new field ID and get rid of the battle mode flag. But because you load up the world map, that field ID stays there as well as the battle mode flag. So when you defeat an encounter on the world map, you get warped to that location. If you just simply walk out of Mount Nibel, there is a piece of code that sets the field ID to 0. Normally, this wouldn't affect anything at all other than just clearing the memory. But in this case, when you defeat a battle on the world map, the game tries to warp you to field ID 0, which crashes the game because there is no field with ID 0. If there was a way to keep the battle mode flag active, get into a battle on the world map, but not finish the encounter, you would be able to change that field ID without initiating the warp. Neohart found a solution to that problem. Simply run away from the battle. Running away from the battle doesn't initiate the warp because it doesn't initiate that no rewards flag. Instead, it operates a different line of code that simply just places you back on the world map. But because we saw that battle ID is now in the place where the field ID should be. And the next battle that we win will warp us to the field ID that matches that previous battle's battle ID. This was an unbelievable find because for the first time, we were able to warp somewhere that we had not been before. Depending on what the battle ID was, it could take you anywhere. You could travel anywhere whose field ID matched a battle ID of some battle on the world map. Now there are about 200 different battles on the world map, and they all have varying results. A lot of them crash, a lot of them place you in areas that you can't get out of, and some of them place you in actually usable spots. But there are two battles that are incredibly important. These two battles place you in the Final Fantasy VII Debug Room. The Debug Room was known about for a very long time, and players had already accessed it with GameShark codes. It is a wild place full of strange rooms, weird model placements, inside jokes, and really strange text. The Debug Room was never meant to be played, so it was only organized in a way that the developers understood. Debug Rooms are always so fascinating because they give a kind of inside look to the development that we wouldn't get otherwise. It was cool seeing the Debug Room with cheats, and it's funny that they would even leave the debug room in at all. But the true dream was to be able to access the debug room without cheats. It would be the ultimate accomplishment to reach the exact room that the developers did not want us to access. Out of all the fields in the game, this is the field that the developers hid away the most. The one room that we are not allowed in. So what an ultimate accomplishment it would be to access this room with just the code written in the game. Over 16 years after the original PC version was released, Neohart had done just that. He had entered the Forbidden Zone, the one place that the developers locked away and threw away the key. The debug room had no entrances, all it had was a field ID, and yet he had done it. He had found the one way to access it. By extension, this also meant that he could pretty much access the rest of the game. The debug room has prompts that will warp you to any part of the game you'd like, as well as the ability to level up your characters to max, give you max materia, all the best weapon and armor, you name it. It was a virtual playground for editing Final Fantasy VII, and we could now access it in a real game with no cheats. We had known for a long time that Final Fantasy VII was a very glitchy and buggy game. But for the most part, you couldn't really skip anything and needed to play most of the game as intended. But this finding completely changed all of that. Not only could you do whatever you wanted in the debug room, but this find started a landslide of more and more skips that were found throughout the game, even on the original PS1 version. Not to mention, this skip also completely revolutionized the PC speedrunning scene. And soon, after some more optimizations to the wrong warp, like taking out that long convoluted setup with Yuffie warping all the way back to Motorball, the PC any percent time would drop under 2 hours. And the New Game Plus run, which had made its return, was under an hour and a half. Now sure, there were still categories that played through the entire game, and the PS1 run at the time only had a few very minor skips. But just seeing what could be done to the game, if stretched to its ultimate limit, was mind-blowing. The rest of the Final Fantasy franchise, for the most part, didn't have any huge skips like this. So to see Final Fantasy VII beaten in under 2 hours was really remarkable and showed how unique of a speedrun Final Fantasy VII had. The route, although a bit complicated, is not very difficult to pull off, which allowed a ton of people to try out the speedrun or just check out the wrong warp and mess around in the debug room, finding new interesting things hidden away in there. This really was the ultimate Final Fantasy VII glitch, and the amount of innovation, dedication, and problem solving put into figuring this out shows how talented members of the Final Fantasy VII community are. In the coming years, people would find even more crazy glitches and skips in the game, but I think almost all of it can be attributed to Zero Kainos and Neohart for jump-starting all of our passion for learning how the game works and how it can be completely broken.